Hey noble ones, welcome back to Metatron's Academy. Today we have a little bit of a speculative scenario. Will the Chinese language, more specifically Mandarin, ever take the place of English as a lingua franca? There are a lot of points that we can make when it comes to how a language becomes a sort of common language, not only internationally or between governments and powers, but also between the people. How, for example, in this case, in our day and age, English is obviously one of the main languages, I would say number one language, when it comes to communication, when it comes to international relationships. And of course, I am aware that there are many other languages that do have that function as well. And clearly each geographic area will have a sort of a different impact on that. But it's language as an end too, so as a secondary language that we are talking about. And there are many reasons why a language becomes such. So the language is most commonly chosen as a second language as a way of communication. If we look, for example, at the ancient Roman Empire, when Latin was basically what English is today, of course, much had to do with the military expansion. So one of the ways, not the only one, in which a language becomes a common language is through force. That is the most obvious one. So in that speculative scenario, hypothetical scenario that we are discussing today, yes, if China conquers the rest of the world at one point, then yes, the future generations will all learn Chinese. That's kind of an obvious consequence. So we're going to look at different types of power, for instance, economic power and cultural influence. Let's have a look at, for example, the economic situation. So one of the reasons why a lot of people decide to choose to learn English, particularly people in my generation, so I was born in 1982, and that's when, for example, in Italy, English wasn't still that common. There were a lot of people that couldn't speak it. Now, in our day and age, however, that situation has changed, and a lot of the youth, even though still Italians are not the best when it comes to how many people in percentage do reach a level of fluency in English, country-wise, still much more common than it used to be when I was like 13, 14. At that time, not many people spoke English. But definitely, economy is one of the reasons why a language may become extremely appealing, because of the possible jobs or job opportunities that the language offers, and also because of the sort of career paths and also job availability in those countries that speak that language, which of course, in the case of English, is many countries, and that is connected to, for instance, the expansion of the British Empire, and more recently, both the economic and cultural influence of the United States. So the appeal of a language is directly proportional to what the language offers to you when it comes to your career, your future, and your children's future. And if you noticed in the last few years, there has been a little bit of a shift in that angle, in the sense that now it has become very common that people speak English, and we are starting to talk about, yeah, but what's your third language? With several people, me included, when I was in my 20s, opting for the Asian side. For example, in my case, I was majoring in Japanese and then got a minor in Mandarin. But before jumping into the cultural aspect, which is also extremely important, I'd like to speak very briefly about the language itself, how much the objective rather than subjective difficulty of a language when it comes to its learning has an effect on how popular it becomes and whether it does become the next lingua franca. Well, in the case of English, that is also one of the reasons why I think English was a perfect link between the Germanic world and the Romance world. So, of course, within the Romance language in Europe, the language family in Europe and all the different subgroups, we've got many languages like Italian, French, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, and all of the different regional varieties. And then you have the Germanic upper section of Europe, where you have languages such as German, but also all the different Scandinavian and Nordic languages. And English served as an excellent connection. I mean, think about it. Originally, English was 100% a Germanic language, but then not only the Romans invaded Britain, first with Julius Caesar and then with Claudius, leaving the first mark, if you will, when it comes from the influence of Latin, but then even more importantly, in 1066, we have the Battle of Hastings, when the Duchy of Normandy decides to conquer and take control of Britain. And that is where a lot of French words enter, and then there is this disconnection between the upper class and the lower class, and a lot of the double vocabulary that we have in English, whereby usually the sort of Romance or Latin rooted words have a more of an eloquent placement, usually. For example, the word matrimony, as opposed to like a wedding, or all the names that connect to the animals, which are clearly German rooted, like pig or swine, cow, and then all of the names of the meat, which was normally eaten by the upper class, which instead are Latin rooted through Norman French. Words such as pork, beef. But because of this connection, this merging between these two realities, the Romance one and the Germanic, English stands in between, and therefore it's easy to learn for a Romance language speaker and it's easy to learn for a Germanic speaker. How much of an effect this had to the popularization of English is difficult to calculate. If you think about it, it probably helped and made it easier, but then again, it wasn't central because even a lot of Asian countries which have absolutely no connections now use English and study English, and Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, they learn English because of its relevance and importance worldwide. This is why a language like Chinese, which instead is extremely difficult to learn for someone who comes from an outsider perspective, would not have this benefit. That doesn't mean that it's not possible for Chinese to ever reach the same level of popularity of English. As I say, very much depends on economic, political, and even cultural influences. But it would be harder because of the writing system unless they ditch it, which I don't think they will, since they already tried to go that way and at the end of the day they didn't do it, which makes it extremely complicated to read and write, but also because of the tones, which is an absolutely fundamental part. It's a core element of the Chinese language, which makes it even more difficult for people to learn. But another aspect that I'd like to mention is now the cultural aspect. So the cultural influence of a country very much speeds up the appeal of a language, even if such language or said language is particularly difficult. And we can see this, for example, with Japanese. And in the last, I want to say, 3 decades probably, because of the Japanese pop culture and subculture, whether it be anime, whether it be manga, whether it be gaming, or even Japanese history up to a certain extent with samurai and all that stuff, that's definitely made the language much more appealing even for demographics and people that weren't particularly affected by both the economic offerings and were not geographically related. And I myself have been subject of this influence because that's why I started learning Japanese, because I was interested in Japanese martial arts because of the movies and then anime and then video games. So definitely the cultural influence is one of the ways by which a language garnishes or recruits students. And America did have a powerful push both through Hollywood, the movie industry, the music industry, and of course also the UK. So all in all, could Mandarin ever become what English is now? There are many factors at play. Everything needs to be seen in the context of a socio-political condition, so whenever this might happen, in 100 years from now, in 50 years from now, in 500 years from now. And so the answer is yes, it could happen, but it wouldn't be as simple of a situation as it was for English, although many factors, as I say, have a direct impact onto whether or not a language becomes lingua franca. But I would like to know, of course, your opinion on this matter. I'm just putting cards on the table for the sake of debate and discussion. What do you think? Will Mandarin ever replace completely English and become the #1 second language or L2 language in the world, or is that not ever going to happen because now English is too rooted and too established? Well, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, thank you for joining ʻmændərɪn Academy.